There is a quote that I used to very deeply admire from Steve Jobs, and it goes as follows. If you live each day as if it were your last, someday you will be right. Every morning I looked in the mirror and asked myself, if today were my last day of life, what would I do differently? And this reminds me of a trend that picked up when I was in middle school, and it was Yolo, you only live once. And the whole idea of Yolo kind of mirrored this way of thinking, this sort of impulsive, live every day as if it were your last, or, that kind of, anxious thinking of, if you're going to die imminently, what are you going to do differently? Just, for the sake of life, so to speak. YOLO, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, is used as a way of describing how you should do things that are enjoyable, exciting, silly, or dangerous. And I think there's a certain profundity in both of these quotes. There's a certain profundity in contemplating death, contemplating life after life, so to speak. And there's a certain profundity, in YOLO, in being willing to do things that are risky, being willing to do things that are perhaps silly, doing things that are enjoyable and exciting by the virtue that they are, silly and exciting and enjoyable. However, there's an aspect of that where we, being fallen people, inclined to partake in sin or corrupt, the natural course of things, in our world, that makes this kind of thinking dangerous. There's a fine line between, YOLO in that, we're sort of trying to properly enjoy the fruits of a good life, and then YOLO in the sense of just being stupid and just doing things that are disordered and dangerous to the gentle soul that we all possess. And in that same manner, there's something profound in, contemplating death and thinking about life after life, but there's something dangerous in it too, because if improperly oriented, it leads to impulsive and just stupid behaviors. I want to say, one of the things that I would grapple with is, if I were to live every day as if it were my last, some of my impulses might be to engage in lust. My impulse might be to engage in, doing whatever I can to get as much money as I can to, just enjoy stuff. Right? There's something that's sort of, making me cave inward, or just think about myself and putting myself at the highest good, the highest thing that there could ever be. And that's the kind of spiritual danger in this way of thinking. And I think the Apostle John highlights this perfectly in his letters, 1 John. In 1 John 2:16, where he says, "For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, and the desires of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world." And so, in light of that, I want to call to mind a different kind of question. And I don't think this is a kind of question that gets asked frequently, if it gets asked at all, which is, instead of asking ourselves how we would live differently if we only had a day to live, or as if this was our only life ever, what if we lived every day as if we had forever to live? And where is this coming from? Well, if you examine the religions, whether it be Hinduism or Buddhism or Islam, Judaism, or Christianity, which is what I'm going to allude to, obviously, there's something about the eternal state that all these religions seem to, talk about. Even atheists talk about eternal life, which is just nothingness. Right, we're going to enter some state of eternity, some state in which everything comes to a fixed point infinitely, so to speak. That's kind of the best way I can sort of speak of it off the cuff of my mind, but when we die, we enter into eternity. We enter into infinity and forever. And so, I guess the way to look at this would be, if where we're going, is eternal and forever, perhaps it's not a bad idea to cultivate our wills such that we're aligned with the entity we will encounter. So if the atheists are right, perhaps we should incline our wills to become nothing, so that when we're, in nothing, we can just be used to it forever and we're just okay with it. It becomes our own heaven. And so in this life, we should just become nothing, so that nothing is in itself heaven. And so the same thing might go with, if you're maybe agnostic or a new age kind of individual, you might think, we just sort of abstractly go into this abstract notion of abstractions. Then you'd probably want to live your life kind of not knowing anything, kind of being vague and undecided and whatever, man, like that's the kind of, inclination of the will you'll want to have. But when you're, let's just say, Christianity, if it's Jesus that you encounter upon eternity, then perhaps it is his will that you would want to be inclined with, such that you are in a spiritual state that is aligned with the kind of eternal life he has set forth for you, so that heaven can stay heaven and not hell. And so what would that look like? Well, if we were to live as if we had forever to live, what would we want to cultivate in this life that would make us a citizen of heaven? What would we want to cultivate that would make us an optimal and fitting citizen for the kingdom of heaven, whether it be nothing or some form of abstraction or the heaven of the Bible or the heaven of Jesus Christ? Well, we'd want to cultivate the following 12 principles. And these are just principles that I've sort of axiomatically kind of came to. 3 of them are the transcendent principles: goodness, truth, and beauty. But the rest are kind of what I think emanate from those things, or sort of stand on the pillars of the transcendental values. And they're as follows: goodness, truth, beauty, virtue, wisdom, profundity, purity, objectivity, clarity, love, order, and wholeness. Well, what does all that mean? Goodness, in that if we're going to orient our lives to just simply be good, and if heaven is going to be simply good, whatever transcendent or eternal entity we encounter is going to be the standard by which goodness is the fabric of reality. And so if that is Jesus Christ, then we must adhere to his standard of goodness, which is written throughout the Old and the New Testament. If the entity we encounter, is the entity that produces truth, then we better be right on who it is, because if we are, living in a lie, then, right, the entity we encounter that reveals the truth to us, well, we're kind of stuck in a moment where we believe this lie and we carry that with us in our souls forever. That is, unless we can, come to a point in which we can change that. But when we're stuck in eternity, we're stuck there because we're in a realm of reality that is beyond our control, right? It's beyond our own comprehension. And so that's why, we say heaven and hell are eternal, because it's beyond human understanding, beyond human comprehension. And so because of that, there's no way in which we can know we can control anything there, which is why us Christians would just say, just repent and believe. But that's a whole different kind of conversation. I want to go into that route. Beauty, right? When we encounter beauty in the world, there's something about it that's drawing us towards something. Obviously, I would say that that's something in the fullness is Jesus Christ. But even speaking more abstractly, if the entity we encounter, in eternity is beauty itself, then if we have convinced our mind that beauty is ugly, then we're going to approach that entity as if it were ugly and wicked and just evil. And so that's kind of why, having a certain spiritual disposition is important when it comes to how we live our lives, because what we orient our will towards, as if we're going to encounter the highest source of truth, goodness, and beauty in this life and in the next. I'm talking very abstractly here. I'm reaching beyond what I can say. But if when we encounter that thing, And we're convinced that whatever we're going to encounter is the fullness of truth, goodness, and beauty, whatever that is. If we're wrong, we're kind of unprepared. We're kind of not, expecting what it is we're going to encounter. And so if that thing that we encounter is Jesus, then, like, for those who don't believe, right, we're going to be convinced that when we see Jesus, that he is evil, that he is a liar, and that he is ugly. And that's just, in general, not a good idea. But if we're wrong about Jesus, well then, yeah, perhaps, I will have created a hell for myself. But you, on the other hand, would have to be absolutely certain that Jesus is not who he says he is. But nonetheless, that's 3 transcendental. What about the next few? Virtue, wisdom, and profundity. Virtue in that we cultivate the kind of behavior in our lives that signify the internal state of our soul. Right? That's what virtue is. It's the outward expression of the inward state of the soul. Wisdom, right? Having a proper understanding of the world such that you can think about things in a manner that sort of leads yourself and others into a common good, into something that transcends reality itself. Profundity, right? Just the simple appreciation and simple, what might be the word for it? The simple, I guess, yeah, that the enjoyment of the simple, beautiful things in life, right? The sort of gentle spirit of, I find that to be really profound. That's kind of why I put profundity in there under the category of beauty. What about purity? When I say purity, yes, I'm kind of invoking the virtue of purity, right? Taking care of the body, but also kind of mentally, the sort of mental clarity, the mental cleanliness of conscience that leads us to just live our lives where we're not burdened by the actions we've done, which is why sin is so bad. When we do something we regret, it sort of degrades the purity of our minds. Objectivity, right? Knowing that there's something there that is unmovable, unchanged, and absolute, right? That's what God is, right? It's just pure objectivity. And so going through all that would take a whole video, but what's the next thing? Clarity. Being able to live a life of absolute clarity, of knowing what's going on in its fullness. I'm telling you, it is so magnificent. It's so awesome. It's so just beautiful. That's what objectivity or clarity does. Love. I think the Apostle Paul writes, right? If we don't have love, we have nothing. Do all things in love. And I don't mean like eros love, not romantic love, but I mean the kind of agape love, unconditional love. But not just for its own sake, but for something that's transcendent, which I would argue is Jesus Christ. And the next thing is order, right? We don't want a life of disorder. We generally agree that order is a good thing, but who establishes order, and how do we incline our wills to the thing that established order itself? And that's the entity that we encounter in eternity. And then there's wholeness, right? The fullness of life isn't just, aggressively engaging in all your pleasures, whether it be greed or lust or sloth or pride or envy or wrath. It's right, whole. It's complete. It's the deepest sense of yourself engaging with the external world. That is what I mean by wholeness. And so that's all these 12 principles I speak of are things you want to cultivate if you want to live as a proper and fitting citizen of the kingdom of heaven. And so it's important that we understand that where do we get these things from? Where do we get goodness from, and truth and beauty from? Where does virtue, wisdom, profundity, purity, objectivity, clarity, love, order, and wholeness come from? Where do these axiomatic truths, these axiomatic principles come from? Right? Because I can't prove these things scientifically. They're transcendental values. But nonetheless, we know that if there is a heaven, that these 12 things will be the foundation of what it means to be a person or a citizen of that heaven. And so I would say that if that sounds like heaven to you, if these 12 principles sound like heaven, then perhaps Christianity is the religion for you, because it is. It's the religion for everybody, whether you want it to be or not. And so why Christianity? Well, Christianity, first and foremost, is the most honest and coherent about the state of the human spirit and the state of mankind. It's what's the word for it? It's when you read the fall and you understand it truly and fully and genuinely, you can't help but realize, like, hey, if mankind truly is fallen, then one, we need redemption, and there is redemption. But two, we want to understand why we are the way we are. Why aren't we inherently evil, but why aren't we inherently good? And that's what the fall explains in Genesis 3. Why Christianity? Well, it's deeply, deeply spiritual. Man, when I was a non-believer, like, I thought I was spiritual, but now that I'm here, like, as a Catholic Christian, engaged in, at this point, don't feel pressured if you are a Christian, like, where I engage sometimes an hour of prayer a day. That's just me and where I'm at now because of just my zeal. But, like, it's deeply spiritual. And you can attest to this by the universality of the converts in Christianity, from atheists to New Age to Islam. People that convert to Christianity just know it's different, it's better, it's more whole, it's complete, it's the embodiment of the 12 transcendental principles that I laid out. It's the most universal. One, because it requires us to evangelize, but two, because, right, it's the only religion in which all the other religions can be kind of baptized into, so to speak, where all religions can kind of come to this focal point, which is Jesus Christ. Why Christianity? Well, because it's quite an absolute religion. Jesus in John 14:6 says he is the way, the truth, and the life. There is nothing more insane than saying you are the entity of truth itself. And so Jesus is either a liar, like the biggest liar in the world, or he is who he says he is. And all of the claims of, that he makes of heaven and hell and the second coming and virtue and vice and sin and all these things, we absolutely need to follow. Otherwise, us Christians are probably the biggest fools in the entire world. And so, nonetheless, in the Bible, Jesus said we all live eternally. We all live forever. And so it's either heaven or hell. And so if that's the case, perhaps it might be a good thing to, in that manner, live conducive and live by conducting our life in a way that makes us a citizen of heaven rather than a citizen of hell. And so, with that being said, of the 12 principles that I just laid out, I kind of want to focus on one, which is virtue, the axiomatic principle of virtue. The first virtue in the Christian walk with Jesus is faith, right? In the Catechism of the Catholic Church, we say that we are first justified by faith. And the reason I point that out is because, all Christians agree, Protestant, Eastern Orthodox, or Roman Catholic, we all agree that faith is the first. It's the primary virtue. And that's how we're justified. But it's not that simple, because faith is really difficult. It's the virtue that takes the most out of you. It requires the most submission from you. It's the most vulnerable. It's the one that requires the most vulnerability, the most trust, yet also the most sincerity. And so, by virtue, faith is the most fundamental virtue of the virtues in Christianity. I think in a manner that's why we call faith a leap. That's why we say, a leap of faith, because you kind of have to go into Christianity not knowing what you're getting yourself into. And so to that, for those of you that are living in the pride of life, Yolo type paradigm of philosophy, I say, why not? If you're so akin to having this open mind or so akin to living impulsively, why not explore a religion that claims to have truth itself in the form of a person, Jesus Christ? If we do have forever to live, why not spend your time here getting used to being in heaven rather than in hell? Being a citizen of heaven does first, yes, require you to put your faith in Jesus, but it's not that you have to leap. And I think one of the great things about where we live in America, in the West, we can kind of take small leaps of faith, where we just sort of understand the maybe intellectual tradition and understanding of Christianity, that's a small leap of faith. And that's kind of how I started. Like, I started by formulating a intellectual framework of Christianity that led me to Jesus himself and his church, which is the Catholic Church. So I say, why not? Why not get used to being a citizen of heaven? Why not cultivate the 12 principles I laid out? Why not enjoy truth, goodness, and beauty here and in heaven? Like, why wouldn't you want both? So with that being said, whatever small step you need to take if you're not a believer yet, take that small leap. Understand the intellectual tradition of Christianity. Maybe understand the spirituality, right? Buy a Catholic Christian book that introduces you to spiritual warfare, like The Spiritual Combat by Lorenzo Scupoli, or Catholicism by Bishop Robert Barron, or Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Whatever small, minimal step you need to take to just take a leap of faith, I say take it. Why not? And when the time comes, join the Catholic Church. I and everybody else, all the saints and the angels in heaven, will be just rejoicing when you get here. And so that's why, in short, I think Steve Jobs is an idiot. Because I think he looked at life wrong. He made this statement that seemed profound at first, but when given enough time and enough wisdom and enough insight, began to realize that it's the very kind of thinking that lead most people from living the life that they could be living. A life of truth, a life of goodness, and a life of beauty in its fullness, that leads to the fruits of, virtue and wisdom and profundity and the like. So please ask yourself, not how you would live differently if you had only this life to live or only one day to live, but ask yourself how you would live differently if you had forever to live.